chat about questions that we received from you all over the course of the week since the previous stream. These are often communicated to us via Discord, and in the absence of questions, we usually just riff with one another. I think Carlos, if I'm not mistaken, I think is it just we have one question or maybe two questions from Vint
Hmm.
this week. Yeah.
We do have a couple of comments from Vince Spice. Um, so I wonder. I don't think it makes sense for me to read the whole thing, but
Mhm.
I don't know, James, if you want to highlight some part of the comments, or because there's a general question. So he references you saying I have a half baked idea for defining the arts and humanities in contrast to science, and this was referring to some previous community forum we had. Uh, so I don't know if you want to address arts and humanities and some kind of what is the relevance of this general uh,
Sure.
field, or
I don't think he's referring to me though. I think he's just because I had been chatting with him privately. I think he was just addressing it to me. So I don't have an idea about it. But I think he says he has some idea about it.
right.
Okay, so Vince has an idea for trying to contrast the humanities and the sciences, which in its own right it raises the question of the degree to which that really should be done. Okay, so he says, so what are the arts? What are the humanities? He says um, he thinks he's viewing arts and humanities as some way for us to externalize or represent ourselves through history, through myths, artifacts, and in some sense, um, I suppose, craft some reducible expression of ourselves. So he's essentially making the argument that, say, unlike something like the sciences, that the humanities are more reducible. And I'm not sure if I agree.
I, wouldn't
I,
wouldn't intuitively wouldn't one think that humanities in some sense are less reducible?
yeah, I mean, so he's making the argument. So okay, I think I can see one way to approach this. On the one hand, I think he's trying to make the argument that at least we're communicating something through some finite, kind of tangible artifact, like a painting or a novel or a piece of cinema. But that, and so I think it's important to maybe to address this because that's not when we discuss things like reducibility, we're not referring to the fact that, say, the artifact itself is, some tangible finite object. Because likewise, you could have some, um, say, algorithm that's quite short or quite simple. Um, so if you take something like a piece of literature or a film, yes, the film is like 180 minutes, or the statue has finite surface area or something like that. That's not the point. It's does it raise a question? Like in the humanities, I guess we would say like does this thing raise a question that you can answer? And I would say, I mean, my favorite form of art is probably cinema. Like the best films are completely open-ended. You know, they they don't have clean plots that tie up neatly. Characters weave in and out. Sometimes the dialogue is rather minimal. The scenes can be rather lyrical. Notion of time can be fragmented or nonlinear, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's no longer about let me tell some crisp story where there's a protagonist and there's some problem and they overcome it and then the protagonist gets a trophy and they live happily ever after. No, it's about using this medium to try to confront the enigmatic. And so I would say that if we're going to use this language of irreducibility with application to the humanities, I would say it's kind of the purpose of the humanities to raise questions or defy closure, at least in many celebrated cases. I imagine Carlos probably has something to say about this too.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if I would personally. I don't know if I would go. I would go into considering the art form itself and sort of the contents of the art form for this kind of angle of the question. Although it is perfectly valid. In fact, I brought that up. I think the comment was referring to when someone mentioned this in the community forum, and I think it was me. I mean, you were making a general comment, and then I said, "Oh, in some areas like music composition, if you constrain yourself enough, it does feel like finding theorems, like proving theorems, sort of finding types of compositions or things like that." So, but I think in the general approach of how, yeah, I mean, humanities and arts, I think, in some sense, they differ from the more sort of computational sciences, from mostly in motivation more than in method. I think, I mean, you can do. I mean, data is data, right? Doesn't matter whether you're measuring like a nuclear reactor, you're measuring like people coming in and out of theaters across the UK or whatever, right? Like, I mean, the data is going to be analyzed and it's already being made into some computational substrate. but I think that, to me that's just science. If you're doing that, you're doing science. It doesn't matter what you're measuring. Of course, you get into the muddy waters of what if the system itself knows that it's being measured, and all that kind of thing, like with economics and so on. But I think the interesting angle is when does it become art, and it stops being science in this sense. And I think it's mostly about motivation, right? I think it's mostly about what do you want to, as a user, what do you want to take out of your experience, of interacting, of engaging with this computational system. And in my opinion, a lot of mathematics is actually art in this definition. Like, I would consider it much closer to the spectrum to art. And I don't mean it to say it in a poetic way, or like to say I am a poet of reason instead of saying I'm a mathematician and things like that. But I do think that pure mathematics is much closer to an artistic endeavor many times than to a scientific endeavor, because at the end of the day you have these agreed upon rules, which they can be easily compared to a canon, right? That you're going to compose or you're going to produce within a canon, and then within the canon you're going to find undiscovered pieces, right? In the artistic analogy. So in the mathematical side, you have, okay, I'm gonna find new theorems, and that's about it. Like, the one thing I find with mathematics though that is different from art, or I don't know if different, but in some sense more freeing or deeper in some sense, I guess, is what hooks a lot of people into mathematics, is this idea that you are the artist and you are the canvas at the same time, in some sense, right? Like you are simultaneously defining the kind of possibilities that your art medium can produce, and are actually performing those possibilities in some sense, right? Because I mean, I'm referring to action systems, I'm referring to whatever computational implementations that you do. Like, if you don't give yourself the tools to do the computations, then you're not going to be able to do them, even if you can imagine them, right? So this is what I mean, right? Like, I mean, it's in a broad sense, really, it isn't like you are both the artist and the canvas, because at the end of the day, you're just doing some kind of activity, some kind of creative activity with some medium that is your thought or your interaction with the world, whatever. But in a more classical approach to arts, where the medium usually defines quite firmly what the constraints of the creation process is, mathematics does feel like you're kind of in control of both the creative production and the medium constraints, right? And so this gives this sense of meta creativity in some way, where you have to be creative within the constraints of the medium, but you also have to be creative to choose the medium. I mean, a lot of mathematicians don't choose the medium because they just, I'm going to work in algebra and I'm just going to work within the medium, or I'm going to do group theory, and that's perfectly valid. That's the vast majority of mathematicians. But some mathematicians decide to sort of push away, and the Grothendieck's in the world, and the set theories, like all these people that really try to push beyond foundations of mathematics and things like that. or people who just are exploring data structures and other forms of non-conventional computation and things like that. I think are exploring this sort of being the canvas of your own art kind of thing, and that to me is something that is quite unique. It's not. I mean, I guess the closest you get to that is something like computer art in general, where you could be developing the engine that in which you then produce the art, and so you have those two sort of you have access to the engine, how things render, and how the graphics are processed, and how the sound is simulated and whatnot. But then within that, you give yourself a sandbox of creativity, and you start doing stuff in the world, right? So yeah, like video game development is kind of close to mathematics in that way. It's kind of a funny analogy, but it really is quite close in my opinion.
Right. I mean, in the sciences, one is like if we set aside mathematics for a moment, you're attempting to develop some formal model that has predictive power over, say, your observation. But in mathematics, it's just the formalism itself.
Mm.
And so it is really just a precise medium for exploring the consequences and possibilities of rigorous, well-defined human inquiry, I would say. But when art, I agree that when art is done well, whether it's in music composition or cinema or something like that, there's also a set number of techniques. People also manage to find that new techniques or properties or forms of expression can be made to appear within the from the right viewpoint, which is something that also happens in mathematics. I went and okay, so I've revisited Vince's question though, and I do want to, okay, I think maybe I understand the specific point that he's making because he's referring to things like history and myths, discussions of like the wars that civilizations have fought, and so here I don't want to steel man the arts too much because yes, on the one hand there are like the Tarkovskys or the James Joyces of this world, but we also have like D.W. Griffith's like Birth of a Nation or Triumph of the Will or American Sniper or choose your form of propaganda. I mean, the arts are also used to close questions as opposed to open them. This is like PR industry or propaganda or myth making. If you learn, say, a historical account from your teacher when you're growing up and it's not fully accurate, maybe you grow up in a society, there were some crimes that were committed, but they're discussed in a relatively benign way. So like, yes, I mean, I would say if the question is about, do civilizations or political entities create myths about themselves in order to take complicated aspects of ethics and history and economic development? Do we create narratives to simplify those? Which is, it seems like that's maybe what he's discussing here in terms of myths and the way that wars are discussed and so on and so on. Then yes, I would say so. And that's actually kind of an interesting means by which you could classify or discriminate between different works that are, say, in the arts or in the humanities. Is this piece opening up questions? Say, is it raising taboos, or is it finding new forms of expression through a medium? Is it taking a concept that is often regarded as relatively straightforward and problematizing it? Is it doing that, or is it finding a way to take the elaborations of history and culture and distill them into something that's palatable and relatively non-controversial? I mean, those are really kind of opposite directions, and it seems as though like he's not referring to like the great enigmatic poetic works here. It seems he's more referring to what I would kind of call propaganda or just kind of production of culture on a mass scale. And that's, yeah, I would agree that's kind of compression. It's a kind of a compressed theory that societies can hold of themselves, and you kind of have to have that if you're going to have some large shared culture, right? You have to say like, okay, I'm from country X or ethnicity X. Well, what are you guys people? What's your, what are your views? What are your history? If it takes like a 4 hour discussion to explain that and its various elaborations, and then, I mean, that's what you would do in intellectual life. But in order to have some easily transmittable kind of sense of culture, yeah, you have to reduce things considerably, I would say. But I would say it's likely abusive to describe that as all of arts and humanities. Arts and humanities can really go in either direction, which is in part why arts and humanities are so important, I suppose, in that I would say in the arts and humanities you have a kind of a responsibility for opening questions and creating the pretense for dialogue and conversations. And if you don't do that, then I would say that these tendencies to reduce questions to cartoonish forms, I think that does happen. And so I think that is kind of the responsibility of self-representation that we see in arts and humanities.
Nick and Łukasz, thoughts on arts and humanities, and because otherwise, I mean, James and I could go on forever.
Yeah.
No, the way I would describe the analogy between arts and sciences, right? But it's in a way they're similar. It's basically science are based on truth, which is the objective, but the arts are something like that is based on subjective instead. So where on one hand, in sciences you have something like axioms or some observations, and then you construct some stuff out of it, right? But in art you have something like style or canon, like you said, right? So, and you still try, it can be based on some subjective values or some developed independently by somebody, but you still kind of stay to the style or whatever and do the development again. So, and the process of development can be described in a way similar. It's just the bases are different.
Right. So
Well,
come.
I'll just say one quick thing. I mean, one interesting question though is to use a term like, say, human nature. I mean, there's this kind of axiomatic prospect to human nature, if I could put it that way, that maybe we also explore in the humanities, which is what are our presumptions about human nature? How does human nature work? What are people like under different, and then you put people in different situations, tragedies, comedies, different kinds of scenarios, and it's like, okay, how do people behave? Can we understand human nature? It's still a matter of subjectivity. It's not necessarily objectivity. It's not necessarily sociology or anthropology, but there's still it still seems like we might be attempting to make inferences about what kind of what humans are like, what human nature is like by these exercises in the humanities.
Yeah.
Or what we could become.
Yeah, just random comment because I wanted to follow up on Nick's comment, because I liked your description, but I have a follow up to see what you think. This reminds me of a lyric from System of a Down, the song called Science. I mean, it's quite appropriate, I think, and I think it's something about, it says, trying to, what is that? Trying to get hold of human existence and measuring and systematizing things we all know, or something like that. It's kind of like, the song is kind of like portraying science as in different ways, and in some ways they are singing very quick, saying science and faith, and it kind of like changes between science and faith that you don't know whether they're saying science or faith. I mean, System of a Down is great. I mean, now we're talking about art, and that's one example of high art, in my opinion. But I think that what Nick said, wouldn't you agree that, I like your characterization and I share it, but wouldn't you agree that there's an actual spectrum of, like, the more objective, like, kind of intersubjective experiences of humans and the more subjective, like intersubjective experiences of humans. I mean, we can only really talk about intersubjective experiences because otherwise we can't really talk about it, right? I mean, but I would say so. I would start from that you know, everything is amenable to being discussed as long as there's some degree of intersubjectivity about it. But I don't know how you can actually say this is about truth and this is about, because you know, beauty is some kind of.
Well, we can put it on the spectrum. You can qualitatively describe truthiness. So
Yes,
if you
yes.
if the science in a completely one end of the spectrum, maybe humanity is in the middle because it's kind of science, but maybe it's not entirely based on truth. Maybe some historical records or whatever, some not perfect experiments, right? And art may be something completely on the different side of the same spectrum.
Okay,
Right.
sorry. That's the quote from the lyrics, but I think the line is somewhere else. It says, "Try and do something things we all know" or something like that. I don't know if I don't have the lyrics in front of me, but obviously
Trying to predict the future of things we all know.
yes, that's the one. Anyway, very, very appropriate. But yeah, but truthness is a nice idea. I like the idea. So yeah, I would say science is the more, you know, truthness focused kind of things. Because then you get into very mixed stuff, right? Like, I don't like the mixed stuff. I like the extremes, personally. Like I like to be fully artistic and I like to be fully scientific. I don't like being in the middle for some reason. Like I was reading today, someone recommended a talk about someone speaking about metrology because I did my PhD in something that had to do with units of measurement and whatever, from a mathematical point of view. And someone sent this and said, okay, who is this person? So I clicked on their profile and I saw some papers about, you know, usual, you know, social justice in mathematics and science and whatnot. You know, when you get into those things, into papers and things like that, things get so muddled up. It's really hard to tell whether you're, like, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, you know, it's unclear whether you're reading, you know, at one time you're reading hardcore statistics that, you know, you can really debate, and then, but very close to it, you're reading things like, but role models are so important because inspire, like completely baseless, like kind of moral statements that, you know, they're very close, you know, in space in the presentation, and those regions really confuse me, and a lot of philosophy feels like that, right? Like where you're being very rational in some sense, but you're at the same time you're being extremely kind of social and like taking into account like the people's emotions in a non-scientific or non-metrological way. It's I don't know. I get confused in the middle ground. I like the extremes of the spectrum, but I have to recognize there is a spectrum. I cannot see that there's a spectrum.
Yeah.
Sorry. Now I actually want to quote the song properly.
Yeah, I like the lyrics too. Yeah.
Because funny enough, I've never seen the lyrics from these songs, and they're very hard to understand for a non-native speaker. Yeah, making two possibilities of reality, predicting the future of things we all know, fighting off diseased programming of centuries. Science fails to recognize the single most potent element of human existence. Letting the regions go to the unfolding is faith. Okay. Science has failed our world, science has failed our Mother Earth, blah, blah, blah. It gets into more political stuff.
But if it's a spectrum, what would be the like the natural desire would be to invent a second axis?
Nice.
What's not enough? What's not enough in the truthiness to just fully describe this?
I mean, although I did say it's a spectrum, I also think that truthiness is an axis. You correctly pointed out. Truthiness is an axis, but I think in art, actually, that's a very good point. I think one of the characteristics of art is that perhaps it's not so focused on something that could be more or less characterized as an axis of truthness, and it's, I think, much more interested in multi-dimensional sort of spaces, right? Like experiential spaces or whatever, creative spaces, something like that, right? Because I mean, if you think about, everyone agrees that, I don't know, St. Matthew Passion or Swan of the Lakes, Lake of the Swans, Tchaikovsky, whatever, like all these big productions, music productions, are in the same sort of genre, broadly speaking, as whatever, a pop song that Taylor Swift has put out, or System of a Down or something, right? But they explore such different corners of feel and mood and vibe, and like you get completely different experiential sensations out of them, right? So I think there's much more like, and none of them is like, I don't know if like what I feel when I listen to System of a Down and like in the very rhythmic kind of aggressive kind of style of music. It's very different to what I listen to Bach, or when I watch a movie, or Lord of the Rings, or a good action movie. I don't know. These are very different mind states, and they just feel like they are sort of like tingling my senses in interesting ways. But there doesn't seem to be like a universal truth, right? To them, it's like, I don't know in what sense this song "Science" by System of a Down is as true as Matthew Passion, as Lake of the Swans, as The Matrix, as I don't know in what sense they are as true, right? Like you can obviously measure how many people watched it and how much money they made, all these kind of metrics that are kind of contextual to the actual pieces. However, you can definitely attribute truthness in that way quite universally to like the theory of evolution, Newtonian mechanics, things like that, right? Like a theory of computing, or like models of computing, things like that. And I think that's what makes science so incisive, right? It's very one-dimensional in this sense, so it makes it very directed. It makes it very clear. I mean, I don't know. Probably why people like us like it. I don't know, because
One distinction I can see maybe in, say, the sciences and the arts is, on the one hand, you have productions, results, tools that have strong instrumentality and satisfy some immediate utilitarian need. So if I'm going to go jogging, and then there's some like boiler room electronic set or something, like music that like I can just jog, and it keeps me motivated to jog for longer, even if in terms of musical theory it's rather impoverished, then it works, so to speak. Likewise, if you manage to find that you're trying to fit some data, do some like food program distribution, you find the Poisson distribution happens to work well, and so you use it and the project goes swimmingly, and it's like, okay, I was able to use some basic statistical methods in order to leverage quantitative thinking in order to do this. So I think that's why, I don't know if it's a spectrum, but they're both in terms of, say, like applied math, and then also commercialized music especially, but I suppose also things like I guess you could see this in the visual arts as well, that it just serves some need as a kind of a good. And then on the far other side of, I don't know, the spectrum or what have you, you have cases where instead of it serving some need that you have, it challenges you in some way, or helps to even reveal something mysterious that you yourself didn't know that you didn't know, for instance. So you watch some film and it triggers in you some radical doubt or uncertainty. It could be the way that the film is produced, like maybe an Antonioni film, and you walk away with it in this kind of contemplative mood.
Yeah.
And
so James, I have a question.
And likewise, I'll just say, like, likewise in mathematics, even if you take like what Mukesh and I are doing on the Langlands program, you find that there's some correspondence. There's no closure. You wonder how far it generalizes. And so it's more of it's like kind of mystery versus utility, in terms of the kind of the pure art, pure math, pure science, and then kind of commercialized um, forms of these things.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just wondering because of what you described, because I've heard that description in that account many times, and like I'm sure that it it feels familiar to a lot of people, but I wonder, because honestly, personally, I've never experienced that. Like if I recall my experience with art, like I have a very strong relationship with art. Like I feel very strongly the things I enjoy, but I don't think if I recall, I look back and try to think what piece of art has, what you described, has revealed something that wasn't quite right. I mean, it was never the watching the piece. I don't know if subconsciously, like a thing was there and then I thought about it. But like, for example, the first time I thought about artificial intelligence or simulation hypothesis, these kinds of things, I had seen The Matrix several times, and it never clicked with me, right? I mean, it was like once I knew. Once it clicked with me, which was this very intellectual mode of processing, of reading and understanding or whatever, then I looked back and thought, oh yeah, that makes The Matrix all the better, right? But when I watched The Matrix, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I enjoy this so much in itself. I mean, it has such nice tempo and nice visuals and nice, like, so I'm not saying this, I'm not making any general statements. I'm just asking also Nick and Vukash in case they had, because I'm curious to hear from people that had these kind of experiences where a piece of art was perhaps I've been too I know too much of a hedonist in some sense, an artistic hedonist, that I'm just I enjoy the piece and it basically the piece ends in itself, right? Like it doesn't, like it moves me and I carry on with my life, and it moves me a lot and it affects me emotionally in my life, but I haven't been very intellectually stimulated by I mean, I don't know, I used to watch, I loved Jurassic Park and things like that, and I did want to go to university to be a paleontologist, but mostly because that's what my parents told me I had to do if I wanted to just do dinosaurs all day, right? Like it was like a very direct logic. It's like I just want to deal with dinosaurs all day, and they said, well, you see what this thing you're doing at school that is so boring to you? If you continue and you get to university, you can do that for all day for dinosaurs. And I thought, okay, that seems good enough. But to me, it was just like, okay, yeah. So I don't know. It never, like the good art that I've enjoyed, it never instructed me or induced any kind of intellectual motion in some sense. Like that intellectual motion always came from just curiosity, looking out in the world. It's like, oh, how does that work? Why is that way? Or things moving, why this, why that, and then reading about science. And it was never like, I don't know, but as I say, maybe I'm too much of an artistic hedonist. So I'm curious to hear from Nick or Vukash, like what experiences did you have, any of these experiences where like art gave you some very strong I mean, maybe we did comment before this about Nick, so maybe you can tell your story.
It's like hacker movies. And then not necessarily not necessarily that one about the sword field, but the hackers. Have you seen one?
Hackers,
Like,
yeah, I know the movie. I haven't seen it.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
like maybe one of those kind of affected me for some reason
Okay.
to pursue to like computing in general, so to be some black hat hacker going into, and I certainly kind of experienced some of the moments in my life and actually doing some sneaky bad things for a little bit. Yeah, so it's not sustainable, but
Right,
yeah,
right. But okay,
but it was motivated for
okay, fair enough.
one
That,
of those things.
I
Yeah.
think that counts as one experience. But I would say though, what you saw was I mean, hacker movies, sure, they are romanticized and they're mostly portraying an activity that can be done, right? Like, I mean, it's more like you're seeing some kind of phenomenon. It looks cool. Don't get me wrong. Like, I wanted to be a pirate when I watched Pirate of the Caribbean. I wanted to be a Jedi when I watched Star Wars. Like, that's absolutely. But like it, I mean, I think what James was referring to, as it sounded, I think, and this is something I've heard many times, right? I heard it many times that art is meant to like leave you with questions. That you made this phrase that I had heard before several times. Like, what was it like? realize that of things that you didn't know or something like that. I can't remember how you put it exactly, but I've had heard those characterizations of art before, and I think they're perfectly valid. But I was curious to see to get examples of that, because I haven't really experienced that sort of thing. Because I mean,
Well,
yeah, go on.
well, I guess for me, it's mostly been watching. It's mostly been, I guess, cinema, especially like international cinema. I mean, one thing about films is that because it's visual and it's moving and there's audio and there are characters and sometimes there's the pretense of plot. You have a certain you approach it with a certain degree of expectations. Now, this is also true of music, which is why when you find odd time signatures or microtones or this kind of thing, that it can also shock you. But in film, especially when you expect a story and you don't get one, and you get something instead, the kind of way in which you navigate those suspended or disrupted expectations can be quite interesting. So things like Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, or Chris Marker's La Jetée, or last year in Mirenbad, even things like Tarkovsky's Stalker. These kinds of films, they don't give you what you would expect. The pacing can be strained. It could be entirely unclear if you're supposed to be following the plot. If you're not following plot, what is it that you should be following? If you can't find some sequence where things seem to be following some kind of some kind of sequence of events that you're supposed to follow. If you begin to gather that's not the director's intention, then what is the point of this? Just to give an example from literature, I know like Thomas Pynchon's work Inherent Vice became quite popular, but I think Inherent Vice is a term from law, which basically says it's basically a term that describes the kind of the breakdown, the kind of dissolution or the erosion of a kind of a legal case over time. And so this is like something I think in literature would be called like an unreliable narrator. You're reading a story, but with time, you actually come to lose your faith in the person who's telling you the story. So then the question is, if you're reading some narrative, but you're kind of disassociated from the protagonist, then what are you supposed to do in that kind of situation? There's another film which I don't recommend anyone watch, especially as I'm CEO of an institute, because it's really aggressive and vile. There's this film called Irreversible by Argentine French filmmaker Gaspar Noé, in which time is really radically fragmented, but it's also about kind of violence and the dark aspects of the human condition. But following that film is like basically completely impossible. So yeah, experiences like that they're difficult. They're quite challenging from the point of view of the viewer, and so you walk away realizing there are things that you wanted, there are things that you expected, and then you have to try and unpack what was it through these transgressive actions where you took a convention, you took an expectation, you broke it. You broke someone's trust, you disregarded someone's attention. There's some implicit kind of agreement between the person who's watching the film, the person who's making the film. As these things have been kind of broken, then you try and develop this good faith that it was broken, but it's because the director is kind of inviting you to consider something new that can be done with the medium, or something about human nature that you hadn't thought of before, or some way of thinking about time or causality or relations, or things like memory or history. This is especially what we saw in like the left bank movement in France right after World War II, but before the French New Wave. So yeah, I think in terms of kind of art house film, that really changed my life in terms of how I think about people, how I analyze things.
So let me get so I understand the like I understand the context you're giving, but what is the causality there? Like what is the so did you like I don't know how to express this, so let me put it right. So something like was the process of your expectation of watching a movie that was maybe more standardized, or maybe more accustomed to the American standard, or something, or the Hollywood standard, or something like that, and then going through the process of seeing all this sea of pieces that existed, all this more international cinema, and then the process of going through them that kind of opened up your eyes, saying, oh, there's all these ways of thinking that are like, is that more or less the causality of, like, for the more intellectual, I'm interested in the kind of intellectual aspect of it, right? Like how I don't know.
There
I'm
are
curious
also-
because it's very alien to me. I'm not criticizing or anything. I'm curious because I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
understand it.
They're also just, and this is, I have to say, like, you know, the two real sources of beauty in my life are probably cinema and math. And I do find similar feelings sometimes, where sometimes, especially if you are a real cinema nerd, there'll be a scene and you can tell it's riffing on something else that you watched, or you can kind of tell based on something that was said, it kind of refers back to something else that happened in that, earlier in the film or what have you. But it's not plot, it's not character development. It has nothing to do with, like, there's a story moving forward, or it's kind of there are kind of these overtones where someone says something or someone does something, and you're no longer thinking of it in terms of, like, the story going forward or what are the characters thinking, but you can see that there are relationships with these, and you have images, you have dialogue, you have the way that the people are moving or the way that things are shot together. That's telling you something, but you can't explain to other people unless you're like a good film critic and you really take some time to think about it. You can't exactly express what it is that they're telling you, but you really, on a kind of intellectual level, even it'll like make you laugh, or you'll think, oh, that's quite clever, or it'll elicit some strong reaction. And the fact that you're making sense of it, but you still can't quite access this mechanism that's making sense of it. That, to me, is this really wonderful invitation that you get from films like this, where it's kind of telling you have these faculties of sense making, of reasoning, that we're going to kind of force you to have to exercise by not giving you something that's easy to digest. And so you realize that there were forms of kind of confusion or doubt or even wisdom or reasoning that, given this kind of difficult material that you didn't really know that you had, and if you enjoy it and you keep watching this kind of thing, it's just this form of, like, emotional or thematic or atmospheric kind of intelligence that you didn't necessarily know that you possessed. And then you can start asking questions using that form of intelligence, and you just didn't know you kind of had it. And you didn't know there were questions in that domain that you could even pursue. It's not easy to even describe this. That's my best attempt.
I would say there are, like, two levels of art in this, and we should distinguish them. One is like the sensory art, when you see, like, something that is just pretty, or just, you sound to the piece of music and it feels good just on the sensory level. But all these pieces of cinema that James talks about, they sort of, there is, like, another level of this art, the art that plays with you. And yeah, they're nice, they look nice, the music in this movies is nice, but sort of what it psychologically does to you, it's like the other level of art here, and, like, another piece of art in itself.
Right.
Yeah.
I think my issue understanding that is, I mean, I totally see that was a very good account, actually. I mean, I could empathize with how that's evoking all that, but I think my issue is when I is basically that I don't try to make sense of anything. In some sense, like if I'm not in an analytical mindset, trying to actually do science in some very directed way, like I take the world as it comes. Like if you present me, like I've enjoyed movies that people normally, say, oh, that's way too artsy or whatever. It's like it's so pretentious, whatever. And I love them, and then I absolutely love to death like things that are completely mainstream, and like because I have just no. I have no filter. I can't. If someone, I know it's a sequence of images and sounds that someone has decided. It's kind of the same feeling I get with solving puzzles. If someone gives me a puzzle, like a pre-designed puzzle, I hate them. I don't like puzzles at all. Like you give me a puzzle, it's like someone has made that. I know it has a solution. I don't care. So it's
Yes.
I don't get much enjoyment in the process of solution execution, right? Like and so similarly, I don't get any pleasure in sort of going into the details of, oh, that shot meant this, that referenced that, and like unless I'm getting something out of it explicitly, like I am enjoying, like I just take it. It's like, oh yeah, that's cool. Like I remember this movie called what's it called, The Tree of Life or something, that has completely disconnected stories that are kind of a mosaic of narratives, and in particular it has sequences with no humans for half an hour, and I loved it because I like my movies without humans if possible, actually. So, and that's a very extreme preference, and I understand. But one of my favorite movies is just like Planet Earth. It's just music and landscape. I mean, that makes a movie for me. Like I don't need more. So when directors decide to do very weird things, I normally just judge them as they come. Like I see it on the screen, I see how the tempo feels. And I basically, this is my personality, right? I unload what I know. It's kind of, I forget what I know when I watch the movie, and I'm there, and it's like, if I want to consciously bring up, oh yeah, there's all this background, history of cinema that came before it, and all these influences and so on. It's interesting. I'm not saying it's not interesting. It enriches the experience and everything, but it's my field of expertise, I would say, is Baroque music, because I've been a Baroque musician for some time, and a lot of people in the guild, so to speak, are very attached to the historical component of it, and I think it's super important, right? Like you're trying to be historically accurate so that you can recover the music and so on. And I always felt kind of as an intruder there, because I was there and I'm like, I just love this music. It's like I couldn't care less. I love history and I love understanding where things comes from, and but I couldn't care less whether you should trill like 3 times up down because Bach wrote this and Rameau wrote that and Couperin wrote that. Like I couldn't care less, like if it sounds great, it sounds great. Like I don't really care, right? And people would have like long discussions about, or no, the trill is actually with finger 2 and 3 and you do this and that, but then Rameau said no. It's like, it's super important these people are doing that, but I'm expressing my position is like, when I'm playing music and listening to music, I actually unload that I know that Rameau was born in this place in France and did this and composed for that, and like I just unload that and I just, okay, it's the music speaking for itself, right? So I'm kind of a purist in this hedonistic artistic perception. It's like, and it collapses a lot of the dimensions that people enjoy about art. So it's not like I'm saying that that's the way people should enjoy art by any means, but yeah, that's kind of, so yeah, why I put same level Star Wars and Bach, and to me it's everything one and the same.
And just one thing, by the way, I also don't like this approach, even to say like films or movies, where it's like a puzzle, where someone will say like, oh, in The Shining or like any Kubrick film, did you notice that there were 7 bottles in the background? Like that's not, for me, that's not the point. It's not solving some puzzle where there's some preset. I think like David Lynch has this problem all the time, where people try and say like, oh, I figured out Eraserhead. It's like, if you think you figured it out, then you've lost the game, so to speak. It's not the point, right? It's not to decode it. It's more of like, say, what you would find in mathematics or elsewhere, which is, what forms of thought, novel forms of thought or kind of reasoning. And I use reasoning not in terms of problem solving, where you're kind of converging towards a fixed point, but really it's like let's say it's not confluent. It's not reaching at anything final. It's kind of just continuing outward basically indefinitely. But you're going now along particular threads according to modes of pattern matching, I suppose, that you didn't really know that you had, and that you don't really use under any other conditions. And so that for me is just something that I like is, are there forms of pattern matching or sense making? And I don't even know what I mean by sense making. It's very hard to put this in words.
But I think
Yeah.
I understand what you mean. I mean you're if you're if you're trying to make sense of what's coming in front of you, then you're sense making, I guess. That we ended up with a very tautological statement, which is probably a good sign. Conversation went well. So there was actually
Well-
before we close it off, there was another component that I thought that maybe because I knew that this would be the juicier part of the conversation, but to bring it back, there was a previous question about Vince Spice saying, I'm not sure if this has been brought up before, but I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on the implications for technology for the of the Wolfram Physics project. So
Well, I kind of have a feeling that there will be a push, maybe in subsequent weeks or months, to try and leverage some of the work done on even like rewriting and multi-way systems for machine learning. I'm guessing, this is my own guess, that Stephen is going to be quite interested in not just doing pure research and then at some point will accidentally take note of ways in which it could be applied. But I think you'll see Stephen with time intertwining those two questions and trying to see if work on one can kind of inform progress on the other. So that's what I would guess, probably. Now, as for how that works, I'm not exactly sure.
yeah,
I will mention that there are people who are interested in this. So even if you take Symbolica, George and Taylor recently co-founded a startup called Symbolica, and I think basically as soon as the physics project launched, they developed a kind of a hypothesis that some of these techniques could be used in machine learning, and they've since been funded. I think Khosla Ventures funded them, and they're active. So this is, I think, the first case of someone actively venturing to make progress in tech using these concepts, and they likely won't be the last. So there have been some people interested in application of some of this to things like distributed computing as well. So Paul Borel, who was actually he attended the summer school last July. He's quite interested in some of the work on, say, causal graphs and rewriting for what he's doing too. So I guess my response is one need not frame the question as there's this pure research that's being done now. What kind of technological fruits could be reaped in the future once that research is done? I think it's over the coming weeks and months, for reasons that I guess we could maybe discuss next week or maybe tomorrow. I think you'll see a deeper interplay between science and technology at the Institute.
yeah, guys. And
Boy, we pivoted that sharply from Tarkovsky to venture capital. Whew.
well, Vince Spice did.
Yes.
This is reverse chronological order of questions. Guys, any other thoughts on? Because I mean, the question couldn't be broader in some sense, but.
Nick, do you have anything you want to say about?
And that should be a topic for next week's community forum. Machine learning, AI, and the kind of themes that we've done at the Institute. We talked about it several times in private. So
Well, Richard should have some things to say about this,
For sure.
since he's kind of actively working on it now, so far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way,
Also, this
Symbolica
question
is a
can be-
yeah, go on.
Also, this question can be interpreted maybe in another direction, how the technology can help the physics project moving forward. By technology, you mean AI.
Yeah. Nowadays, they're synonyms, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're done. We've moved past, all technology. It's all AI now.
Yeah, like if you say I have a tech company, it's not like you're working like in improving wheelbarrows or something. It
Have
basically
you
means you're using.
have you seen this trend where basically every other tech company name has AI in the name for some reason? Like I've seen this
Wow.
trend lately where this new tech company has AI in the name. I see, and it's like completely random word and then AI at the end. It's like okay.
Yeah. That's like the little worm that you put on the hook to attract investors, basically.
Yeah. So just for context, Symbolica is a ride in an amusement park in the Netherlands.
Okay.
Because I couldn't Google it because it's dominating the search. Apparently, it's very fun.
Oh, I should tell George and Taylor that they have, that they have, that they have their SEO problems from an amusement park, from a Dutch amusement park.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I think very, very interesting topics. Very nice conversation today.
Yeah. We haven't really riffed about this in particular. So thanks, Vince, for suggesting this. And yeah, please send us some more. It's always nice when we have like one question or two that stimulates an hour worth of discussion. Though you could kind of ask Carlos and I anything, and we would banter for.
It's almost like we are avatars and we have some kind of model for a generation of text, right? I mean, it almost feels like that.
All right. Well,
All right.
this has been a fun community forum. We'll see you all tomorrow at our roundtable. Same time, different day.
Yep.
In the future. And that can only really be tomorrow.
All right.
All right. See you all.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Yep,
Cheers.
cheers.